So this is college. So my grandpa's teaching me these things. And I remember as my grandpa's teaching me it, I would understand it a little bit, and I would understand the idea of transcending the self. And I remember like one time I talked to my grandpa about like the idea of a toothpick, how like I would be chewing on a toothpick, and I thought to myself how I'm paradoxically confirming myself, but at the same time when I'm chewing on my toothpick, I'm thinking about the toothpick, and it's taking my mind off myself, and I'm also transcending myself, and it's also, so in a way it's facilitating the flow and the losing of the self. And that's what the whole flow is. It's when you lose yourself. And I guess it's, so in the idea, like just one example of that would be like Einstein. My grandpa would tell me that Einstein said that when in search of a question, you have to exhaust your resources, and then perhaps when you're eating an apple, the answer will tap you on the shoulder and say, "Here I am." And the idea is when you're eating the apple, that's when you let go, and you're no longer trying to make things happen, quote unquote, right? And you free yourself, and you're no longer trying to discover the answer. That's the flow. And then that's when the inspiration comes and the answer hits you. And so that's the idea, is the self hurts things. The self, a lot of times, like when you try to make things happen, you try to manipulate things, you end up screwing things up. But then when you transcend the self, and it's not necessarily letting things be, because that could also be the ego that lets things be. But my grandpa says you have to prepare, and then you let go, and then the answer comes to you. And he says that that's another reason why like people say that they have epiphanies in dreams, because in dreams it's like it's almost a state where you're transcending the self and you're letting go a little bit. You're in the sleep state, and that's when people have these like revelations sometimes. So that's kind of what my grandpa's getting at with the flow. So my grandpa's teaching me these ideas, and it's very good stuff. But at the same time, I don't really understand it at that time. Now, one thing, but I do understand it a little bit. Like, but one thing my grandpa would talk about is like not being attached. So the idea with like attachments, again, it would be, my grandpa would say that's the ego. So if my grandpa would say, if you're in the flow, you're not attached to any one way of seeing things, because if you're attached to anything, then you can't be in the flow, because when you're in the flow, I'll just say, like, let's say you're playing basketball and you're attached to like, I'm always gonna, like, you're dribbling down the court and you think, I'm gonna shoot the shot this time. But then what if the guy comes up on you really fast, and he leaves a lane open, but you're already decided, I'm gonna shoot it. And then you shoot the ball because you already made up your mind. But if you're in the flow, you're not gonna be attached to any one thing, and you're just gonna be completely in the moment, completely spontaneous. But that's like just one like very obvious example. But just an example, my grandpa would be like, if you're in the flow, let's say you have you study a lot. If you're in the flow, you can let go, and you can have a revelation that will, defies rationality. Like, for instance, Einstein's theory of general relativity, that defies rationality, that, that space and time are not, that they're not constant, and that there's, that they're malleable kind of. But my grandpa would say, well, he exhausted his resources, he studied, he went all out, and then he could let go, and then he could have a revelation. And that's inspiration. It's not coming from him. That can't come from the ego. That can't come from rational thinking. That can't come from rationality and the normal modes of thinking. So that has to come from a higher state, and that's the flow. And so, but if you're already attached to your ways of seeing things, you're not going to be open to that higher truth. So you want to let go of attachments. But now this is a part of the reason why I lost my basketball videos, was because at that time I was very into that idea. Like, okay, well, I'm not going to be attached to anything. So as I said, when my parents came to help me pack my stuff, and I showed them the quadrant model stuff, my mom and dad were like, this isn't the theory of everything. You have schizophrenia. This is a delusion. And I was really upset, and I was really flustered. And I yelled at them, and they left. And then I was stuck to, I had to pack all my stuff myself. But also a part of me was like, well, I'm not attached to anything, and I'm in the flow. So, and at the time I'm going to get to this, but I didn't understand the swag flow. So in my mind, the videos that I had weren't that big of a deal. I was like, whatever, I have these videos, it's not that big of a deal. I'm not attached to anything. I'm one with everything. So a part of it, I'm not going to lie, a part of it was I left my box of basketball videos, like at least 30 videos that would, if people would have seen those videos, they would be just like, they would be astounded with how good I was. And it would help me so much to study them, because at that time I didn't study them like I do now, but it would help me to see what I did when I was unconscious, when I was, it would help me fix my shot a lot. It'll help a lot of things. And I also want to study the swag flow. I'm not going to get into details about what that is. I don't want to make people too conscious. But a part of it was because I was like, I'm not attached to anything. So I left a ton of stuff that day, including that. But in my mind, I'm like, I'm not attached. I'm one with everything. But, my grandpa would later tell me, he would say, well, that's also a form of attachment. You're attached to being not attached. If you're in the flow, now I understand, like, if you're in the flow, you're not attached to anything, even not being attached, and everything you do is optimal and it's perfect in the flow. But I didn't understand it at the time. Now, this is a part of how my grandpa could mess people up a little bit with his teachings. And I think that that's what he did with my parents, because he would give them the teachings, but they misinterpreted it. And they, as my grandpa even says, they incorporate it within their way of seeing things and their lower levels of software that they haven't upgraded to really benefit from the teachings. You could only get what you're prepared for, what you're ready to receive. So, but regardless, that's another sad thing that happened at that time. As I said, I lost those videos because of that. But so my grandpa's teaching me this stuff, and at the time I don't really quite understand it. I'm kind of understand it, but I don't. And as I said, I was kind of more of a leftist. So at the time, I start calling my grandpa every day, and I start reading the Bible with my grandpa. So every day I would call him and we would read the Bible for like maybe an hour or something. And as I'm going through it, I'm trying to understand my grandpa's perspective. So my grandpa's perspective is that Jesus, again, you don't want to believe anything. Because my grandpa would say, if you believe anything, you're not in the flow, because then you're attached and your beliefs just come from your ego. So what you want to be is you just want to be receptive to inspiration, and you want to study as much as you can and get as much knowledge as you can, and then be open to inspiration. Now, he would say, though, some beliefs can be beneficial, like the belief that Jesus died on the cross. He would say, yeah, some things, you have to have a stable ego before you can transcend your ego. So you can have these beliefs, but really what he would say, but the belief about Jesus dying on the cross would be the belief in transcending the self. What that's ultimately pointing to is the truth of the importance of transcending the body, transcending the self to the flow. So stuff like that. So it gets complicated. I'll just give like one more example that my grandpa teach me a lot later would be like, I asked my grandpa, like, what do you think of patriotism? Like people who are patriots for their country. My grandpa would say, well, a part of that is transcending the self. You're a part of something larger than yourself. So you're not just focused on yourself, but you're focused on your country and the people in your country. So, but then he also says, though, but there's a paradox, because it could also be self-confirmatory, because now you're for your country, but now you're identifying with your country. And if you're just identifying with your country, you might not be open to the truth, because your vision could be distorted by that. So there's always paradoxes involved with this stuff. But ultimately, when you're in the flow, it's pure awareness, and you're connected to the truth, and it's inspiration and, receptivity to what is, with a capital I, to being itself. That's the idea. That's what he's trying to that's his main teaching. But again, even he says that he could be full of shit, but that's the teaching of metapsychiatry pretty much. So at this time, I'm reading the Bible with my grandpa, and I don't really quite understand what's going on, but I'm trying to understand his perspectives. But now this is the thing, is my grandpa, even though he says he doesn't believe anything, he says that he has frameworks of understanding. So my this is what Dr. Hora taught. Dr. Hora didn't teach that Jesus was God, but he saw Jesus more as kind of like a man. But Dr. Hora thought that everything's an illusion anyways. It's all just like, there is no self, there is no thing. So, Dr. Hora would basically describe that, just the notion of transcending the self. So, but my grandpa, Dr. Hora thought that God was infinite love intelligence. That's what he said God was. Now, what my grandpa would teach, though, is my grandpa said, that's why I understood in 2020 when I read Dr. Hora's book, but I didn't know that until 2020. But my grandpa would teach is, my grandpa thought that God is energy. That's what my grandpa said. God is energy, and everything is energy, and everything is one, because it's all just one energy event, and there's different manifestations of the energy, but everything is energy, and God is energy. So that's what my grandpa thought. But my grandpa would say, I don't believe that, because he doesn't want to believe anything, because he wants to be open to the truth. But that was what he would say is his framework of understanding, which he's not attached to. He doesn't want to be attached to it, so he could be open to the truth. but that was his framework of understanding. And so my grandpa would talk about like, so I'm studying this stuff with my grandpa. So like one thing that my grandpa taught me was like, I asked him like, what do you think about homosexuality? So remember, I'm very liberal, and I think that because I see myself as Jewish, I'm very sensitive to anything that I perceive as not being liberal, because I see non-liberals as Nazis, in my opinion, right? Because I think that's the way a lot of like Jewish people are, or even, because it's like, so you don't believe that homosexuality is okay? Oh, well, you must be like Hitler, who like killed the homosexuals and the Jews and stuff, right? So I think that that's the way that I'm leaning more toward that direction. So, I asked my grandpa, what do you think about homosexuality? And my grandpa says, I don't believe that there's such thing as homosexuality, as a homosexual. So I'm like, that's confusing me. So I'm thinking, well, is my grandpa kind of a Nazi? Like, is he a right winger? Because I don't like right wingers. This is me in college. I'm very left wing oriented. So my grandpa's confusing me. Now it took me a while for me to understand all this stuff. But so my grandpa's saying, well, now I understand what my grandpa was meaning is like, if you're in the flow, you're not attached to any identity, and even your proclivities, those aren't you. In the flow, you transcend the self, you transcend the ego, and so there is no homosexual and stuff. But and my grandpa would say everything is energy, and so you are not your body. You are not. This is like one thing that one illustration my grandpa would give is he would say, okay, if I spit on the ground, did I spit on you? I would say no. He says, okay, I spit on your shoe. Did I spit on you? I'd be like, well, maybe. Be like, well, I don't know. Is that you? If I spit on your knee, did I spit on you? He's like, where do you stop and where do you begin? He's in my grandpa's mind. It's like it's a social construction kind of like, why do you identify with the body as opposed to, why aren't you over there also? And like, so like the idea that we have these artificial construction of what the self is, who you are, but my grandpa, his whole thing is like, there is no self. That's kind of what metapsychiatry teaches. And the whole idea is to transcend the self to the flow. So, but I'm confused about this. So when my grandpa's telling me he doesn't believe in homosexuals, I'm thinking like, is he a right winger? Like, I don't really quite get what he's talking about. And then my grandpa would talk about a lot like, so I remember I asked him one time, I was like, Grandpa, what do you think? Why do you think that so many Jews get the Nobel Prize? Is it because Jews have higher IQs? Is it because they're smarter? And my grandpa's like, no, I think it's because, because they're a minority who's been discriminated against, they work harder. And then they get the Nobel Prizes. So I'm thinking to myself, is my grandpa, again, is he kind of like a right-winger Nazi and he's like trying to look down upon Jews? But, now I see what my grandpa's trying to say. He's trying to say like a part of existential metapsychiatry, this is the existential part, is my grandpa's, and I don't necessarily agree with this, but my grandpa's whole thing is like existentialism that teaches that you don't want to blame anything, including God. So Nietzsche was kind of an existentialist, and what Nietzsche taught, and this is what my grandpa likes too, is he would be like, okay, a lot of religious people, like let's say a religious person, he says like, okay, I don't have sex because I'm going to go to heaven, and now I'm going to go to heaven. So then he gets like an air of superiority, like, yeah, okay, so yeah, he's a prude, and he's very rigid, and he thinks that he's superior in that sense. So now he's going to go to heaven. But my grandpa would be like, yeah, but that's also a form of arrogance, and he's still focused on the self, and he's still focused on saving the self, but the self is an illusion. So then the idea is, well, then maybe he should just go, become very promiscuous and just have sex all the time. And that would be like the Shiva path. That would be like the satanic path, and just, having sex with everybody and becoming like a prostitute or becoming a pimp or something, like just promiscuity. But then my grandpa would say, well, that's, you could do that, but that's also a form of self-confirmatory. That's also confirming self, and there's negative consequences that come out of that. And he said, my grandpa would say, it's not existentially valid. It leads to unhappiness in a lot of ways. So that also is not necessarily transcending the self, but neither is necessarily the first path of being prude. You can still, so that's why my grandpa would say, as the Bible says, you cannot save yourself. You can only be saved by grace. That idea is the flow cannot happen. You cannot make the flow happen. If you're making the flow happen, then that's not the flow. Then that's you still. The flow only comes through grace. So long as you're involved, it's not the flow. So now my grandpa would say, yeah, the promiscuity path, you could even be saved by that. As the Bible says, the rain falls on the just and the unjust. The reign is grace. So, you can be unjust and you can still be saved. That's what the Bible says. Like, salvation comes through grace. Salvation comes through faith. Like, you can't necessarily, your works can't necessarily save you. So the idea is like that person who's on the satanic path, he can be saved because, as my grandpa would say, you can lose yourself in that high level of aliveness, and even you can get yourself in trouble, and that can force you to turn toward a better path. But the idea is like, but the person who never got himself in trouble in the first place, kind of like the prodigal son, like in the prodigal son story, that he leaves and he does a bunch of sins, but then he comes back and he's better off than the brother that stayed the whole time. And the idea is, well, because he enriched his consciousness, he expanded his awareness, he's more susceptible to the flow, to the truth. Whereas the first son, he just stayed in his comfort zone and he never expanded, he never grew and broadened his awareness. So he's more in a state of ossification, and he's more in a self-confirmatory state, or state of the self. So the idea is like there is no formula for the flow, and salvation comes through grace. So this is the type of stuff that I'm starting to learn, but I don't really quite get what my grandpa's talking about at this point. So it took me a very long time to start understanding that stuff. So my grandpa's trying to teach me. So like the idea is, yeah, if you that person who's doing the sinful path, he can save himself he can lose himself, or it can cause him to do a U-turn, and he can, go toward a more existentially valid way of living, and he will be benefited more than the person who was always a prude, and because the person's always a prude, he's in conformity, and he never learns anything, and he never expands his awareness at all. So he's more stuck in that, and he never realizes that he's stuck in the self and he's not in the flow. And he also gets social approbation because he's within a social setting where people are approving of his mode of being, conforming. So it's very complex. Metapsychiatry is very complex, but but also at the same time, it's not so complex that you can kind of understand what my grandpa's trying to say. So this is what my grandpa's trying to teach me at this time, but I don't really understand it. And like I said, he didn't teach me very well. What I taught you right now took me many years of studying with him to start to understand, because he didn't teach me very well. I could teach someone that very quickly, but learning from my grandpa, it took a very long time to understand that. So at this time, I'm confused. So my grandpa's telling me that in his view, and this is his framework of understanding, he says that Jesus did perform miracles. Jesus did, like, he can turn water to wine, and he could multiply bread, and he can do all this stuff. Now, me at this time, I understood. Now, I was very anti-religious. And again, this was my ego, and I wasn't even aware of it. Now, look at this. So it all makes sense to me now, but because I'm like, okay, I didn't transcend my ego, and I was still caught in my limited perspective. And I thought that I knew a lot, but I didn't know a lot. And my ego was clouding my vision, but I wasn't aware of it at the time. So at that time, I was very anti-religious. Like I said, I was kind of anti-white, and I was anti-religious. And I know why I was anti-religious. A big part of it, I think, was because I was anti-white. And I think that I thought in my mind that religion was a form of white supremacy. So like, I would be like, I would be watching like Fox News, and I would think, well, these guys are just white supremacists. They just like religion. They like Christianity because Christianity allows them to justify keeping borders up on the southern border, and keeping the Mexicans out, and keeping the Arabs out, and it's all just a subterfuge of white supremacy, and Darwinism, and keep maintaining the white race is superior and stuff. So I was like, in my mind, I hated religion because I thought religion was just a fake way to maintain white supremacy. That's the way I saw it. So in my mind, as my grandpa's teaching me this stuff, I'm thinking, well, my grandpa's kind of maintaining religion in a way. He still believes in Jesus. And I didn't want to believe in Jesus. In my mind, I thought Jesus was fake. I thought that I was like, dude, this guy's clearly just a mythical figure. Like, this guy obviously doesn't really exist. Like, people can't tell that. So as my grandpa's teaching me, so my he's saying, no, he's a real figure. He really can do these things. He could really multiply bread and stuff. But in my mind, I'm like, no, this guy's a myth. And I didn't like religion because I saw it as white supremacist. So this is what my grandpa's teaching me in college, and this is kind of where my mind is at. But I'm not telling my grandpa this. I'm letting my grandpa teach me what he believes, but this is what is in my mind. I'm thinking, I don't like religion. I don't, especially Christianity, because in my mind, Christianity is the most white supremacist. So I'll continue.